Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises? Or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. What I'm going to reveal to you today is the untold story of how Chicago's underground drinking establishments became breeding grounds for a different kind of epidemic. Not just illegal alcohol, but crippling addiction that turned ordinary people into shadows of themselves. This isn't the glamorous story Hollywood wants you to believe. This is the real story of how prohibition didn't just create criminals, it created addicts on a scale that America had never seen before. But first, let me tell you about someone whose story will change everything you think you know about this era. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, and in 1923 she was a 24-year-old secretary working in downtown Chicago. She had dreams, aspirations, a loving family who believed in her. She also had a secret that would ultimately destroy everything she held dear. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how Chicago's speakeasy culture didn't just break the law, it broke people. You'll discover the hidden mechanisms that turned social drinking into life-destroying addiction, and you'll see how the very places that promised escape became prisons that trapped thousands of souls in cycles of desperation they could never break free from. Margaret's story begins on a cold February evening in 1923. She had just finished another exhausting day at the insurance office where she worked, typing letters and filing papers for 12 hours straight. Her fingers were sore, her back ached, and all she wanted was to go home to her small apartment on the north side and collapse into bed. But her friend Dolores had other plans. Dolores was everything Margaret wasn't. Bold, adventurous, always chasing the next thrill. She grabbed Margaret's arm as they left the office building and whispered something that would change Margaret's life forever. "There's a place I know," she said, "where they serve real gin, not that bathtub poison everyone else is peddling. The music is incredible, the people are sophisticated, and tonight we're going to forget about everything that's weighing us down." Margaret hesitated. She had heard the stories about these underground places, these speakeasies that operated in basements and back rooms throughout the city. But she also knew they were dangerous, illegal, and exactly the kind of place her mother had warned her about. Yet something in Dolores's eyes, some promise of escape from the monotony of her daily routine, made her nod. Yes. The speakeasy they entered that night was called the Blue Moon, hidden beneath a seemingly innocent flower shop on Clark Street. To get inside, you had to know the password, which changed weekly. You had to walk through the flower shop, past the elderly woman arranging roses, who would size you up with suspicious eyes, then through a door marked private that led down narrow wooden stairs into a basement that had been transformed into something magical. The moment Margaret stepped into that underground world, she understood why people risked arrest, fines, and social disgrace to be there. The room pulsed with energy she had never experienced before. Jazz musicians played in the corner, their music flowing like liquid fire through the smoky air. Men in expensive suits leaned against the bar, talking in hushed tones about business deals and political connections. Women in beaded dresses laughed with abandon, their voices mixing with the clink of glasses and the shuffle of dancing feet. But what captured Margaret's attention more than anything else was the atmosphere of absolute freedom. Here, in this hidden space beneath the city, normal rules didn't apply. Social conventions were suspended. The weight of daily responsibility seemed to lift from everyone's shoulders the moment they walked down those stairs. Dolores ordered them both something called a bee's knees, a cocktail made with gin, lemon juice, and honey that masked the harsh taste of the bootleg alcohol. Margaret took her first sip and felt warmth spread through her chest, followed by a lightness in her head that made everything seem brighter, funnier, more interesting. The conversation around her became more engaging, the music more beautiful, her own thoughts more clever and profound. For the first time in months, Margaret felt truly alive. What Margaret didn't understand that night, what none of the people crowding into the Blue Moon understood, was that they were participating in something far more complex than simple rebellion against an unpopular law. They were becoming part of a massive social experiment that would reshape American attitudes toward alcohol, addiction, and personal responsibility in ways that are still affecting us today. The Volstead Act, which enforced prohibition, had been designed to eliminate alcohol consumption and the social problems associated with drinking. But instead of creating a sober, moral society, it created an underground economy that operated by entirely different rules. And those rules, as Margaret would soon discover, had consequences that nobody had anticipated. Chicago in 1923 was a city transformed by prohibition. On the surface, it appeared to be following federal law. Saloons had closed, liquor stores had shuttered, and public drinking had seemingly disappeared. But beneath this facade of compliance, an entire parallel world had emerged. A world of speakeasies, bootleggers, and organized crime that operated with increasing boldness and sophistication. The numbers tell part of the story. Before Prohibition, Chicago had approximately 7,000 licensed saloons serving a population of just under 3 million people. By 1923, estimates suggest there were more than 10,000 illegal drinking establishments operating throughout the city. These weren't just replacements for the old saloons, they were something entirely new. The old saloons had been neighborhood institutions, places where working men would stop for a beer after their shift, where community news was shared and local politics discussed. They closed early, served relatively weak beer and wine, and operated under at least some regulatory oversight. The speakeasies that replaced them operated in shadows, served much stronger alcohol, stayed open all night, and attracted a clientele that crossed all social boundaries in ways that had never happened before. Margaret began visiting the Blue Moon regularly. What started as an occasional Friday night adventure became a twice-weekly ritual, then an almost nightly escape. She told herself she was just unwinding after work, just enjoying the social atmosphere and the excitement of being part of something exclusive and sophisticated. The Blue Moon became her refuge from a world that seemed increasingly grey and limiting. At work, she was just another anonymous secretary in a sea of anonymous workers. At home, she was the dutiful daughter who sent part of her paycheck to her parents and lived quietly in her small apartment. But at the Blue Moon, she was someone different, someone interesting and alive and free. The regulars at the Blue Moon became her real social circle. There was Tommy, the charming bootlegger who always had the best stories about narrow escapes from federal agents. There was Victoria, the banker's wife who had grown bored with her comfortable but predictable life and found excitement in the underground scene. There was James, the jazz musician who played piano with such passion that listening to him felt like receiving a direct transmission of pure emotion. These people understood something that Margaret's co-workers and family didn't understand. They knew that life was short, that opportunities for real experience were rare, and that sometimes you had to take risks to feel truly alive. They shared a secret knowledge about how to access pleasure and excitement that the straight world couldn't provide. But there was something else they shared, something that none of them talked about directly, but that became increasingly obvious as the weeks turned into months. They were all drinking more than they had ever drunk before, and they were drinking alcohol that was far stronger and more dangerous than anything that had been legally available before Prohibition. The gin served at the Blue Moon wasn't the carefully distilled, regulated product that had been available in pre-prohibition saloons. It was bootleg liquor, manufactured in hidden distilleries using industrial alcohol, questionable additives, and production methods that prioritized speed and profit over safety or quality. A single cocktail at the Blue Moon contained more pure alcohol than 3 beers at the old neighborhood saloon. More importantly, the social context of drinking had completely changed. The old saloons had been embedded in community life, subject to neighborhood oversight and social pressure. Men might stop for a drink after work, but they were expected to go home to their families at reasonable hours. Excessive drinking was discouraged by bartenders who knew their customers personally and by social norms that valued moderation and responsibility. The speakeasies operated by different rules entirely. They were businesses built on secrecy and exclusivity, designed to maximize profit from customers who were already breaking the law just by being there. There was no community oversight, no social pressure toward moderation, and no expectation that customers would maintain normal schedules or responsibilities. Margaret found herself staying at the Blue Moon later and later, drinking more and more, spending money she couldn't afford on overpriced cocktails that left her feeling sick and disoriented the next day. But the alternative, returning to her regular life without the excitement and escape that the speakeasy provided, seemed unbearable. She began calling in sick to work more frequently, telling her supervisor that she was suffering from headaches or stomach problems. She stopped visiting her parents on Sundays, claiming that she was too busy with social obligations. She lost weight, developed dark circles under her eyes, and found herself thinking about her next visit to the Blue Moon from the moment she woke up until the moment she walked down those stairs into the smoky basement. What Margaret was experiencing wasn't unique to her, wasn't a personal failing or moral weakness. She was caught in a trap that had been created by the intersection of prohibition laws, criminal economics, and social changes that nobody fully understood at the time. The speakeasy culture that seemed so liberating and sophisticated was actually a perfect storm of factors that made addiction more likely, more severe, and more difficult to escape than anything America had seen before. The very illegality of the speakeasies created psychological conditions that encouraged excessive consumption. When something is forbidden and dangerous to access, people tend to consume as much as possible when they do gain access, uncertain when the next opportunity will arise. When drinking requires elaborate planning, secret passwords, and constant vigilance against police raids, the act of drinking becomes charged with excitement and meaning that goes far beyond the simple desire for alcohol. The psychology of forbidden pleasure was working on Margaret in ways that would have been impossible in the old legal saloon system. Every night she spent at the Blue Moon felt like a victory against the forces trying to control her life. Every cocktail she consumed felt like an act of rebellion against a society that seemed determined to drain all joy and spontaneity from existence. She wasn't just drinking alcohol, she was drinking freedom itself. But Margaret's story was playing out simultaneously in thousands of other lives across Chicago. The city's speakeasy culture wasn't creating isolated cases of problem drinking. It was systematically manufacturing addiction on an industrial scale. And the people running these establishments understood exactly what they were doing. Vincent Torino owned the Blue Moon, along with 4 other speakeasies scattered throughout Chicago's north and west sides. He was a thin, well-dressed man in his 40s who spoke with a slight Italian accent and treated his establishments like theatres where he was directing elaborate performances of rebellion and sophistication. But Vincent understood something about human psychology that most of his customers never suspected. He had learned that people didn't just want to drink, they wanted to feel special while they drank. They wanted to believe they were part of an exclusive club, members of a secret society that possessed knowledge and experiences unavailable to ordinary citizens. So Vincent crafted every detail of the Blue Moon to reinforce that feeling of specialness and exclusivity. The password changed weekly, not because of security concerns, but because the act of knowing and speaking a secret password made customers feel like insiders. The elaborate ritual of entering through the flower shop wasn't necessary for concealment. It was theatre designed to make each visit feel like a meaningful event rather than a simple transaction. The expensive furnishings, the sophisticated cocktail names, the jazz musicians, even the carefully curated mix of customers from different social classes. All of it was calculated to make people believe they were participating in something culturally significant. But Vincent's real genius lay in understanding how to manipulate the drinking patterns of his customers to maximize both his profits and their dependence on what he was selling. He had discovered that people who felt special and exclusive while drinking would consume far more alcohol than people who were simply trying to get drunk. They would also pay premium prices for that alcohol, and most importantly, they would return night after night to recreate the feeling of being part of something extraordinary. The cocktails served at the Blue Moon were designed according to principles that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with creating psychological and physical dependence. The gin-based drinks that were Vincent's specialty contained nearly 3 times the alcohol content of pre-prohibition beer, but the honey, fruit juices, and other mixes masked the harsh taste and burning sensation that might have warned customers they were consuming dangerous quantities of alcohol. More insidiously, Vincent had learned to manipulate the strength of drinks throughout the evening to create what his bartenders privately called the escalation cycle. Early in the evening, when customers were still sober and cost-conscious, drinks were mixed relatively weak and priced reasonably. As the night progressed and customers became more intoxicated and less price-sensitive, the alcohol content increased while the prices rose dramatically. By midnight, when customers like Margaret were fully under the influence and desperate to maintain their euphoric state, Vincent's bartenders were serving drinks that were essentially straight-grain alcohol with minimal mixers, charging prices that represented a full day's wages for most working people. Customers paid these prices willingly because their judgment was impaired and because they had become psychologically dependent on maintaining their membership in the Blue Moon's exclusive social world. Margaret had no awareness of these manipulations. From her perspective, she was simply enjoying herself at a sophisticated establishment where she felt appreciated and alive. But her consumption patterns were following the exact trajectory that Vincent had designed them to follow. She had started visiting the Blue Moon once or twice a week, ordering 1 or 2 drinks and leaving by 11 o'clock. Within 2 months, she was there 5 nights a week, consuming 4 or 5 cocktails per visit, and staying until the early morning hours. Her weekly alcohol expenditure had increased from roughly $2 to more than $15, representing nearly half her total income from the insurance office. More troubling was what was happening to Margaret during the hours she spent away from the Blue Moon. She found herself unable to concentrate at work, constantly thinking about the conversations she would have that evening, the music she would hear, the feeling of warmth and confidence that would wash over her with each cocktail. Her regular life began to feel like a grey intermission between the real moments of living that only occurred in Vincent's basement establishment. She started drinking during the day to cope with the anxiety and depression that seemed to descend whenever she was away from the speakeasy environment. She kept a flask in her desk drawer at work, filled with bootleg whiskey that she purchased from Tommy at inflated prices. She told herself this was just to smooth out the rough edges of her workday, just to maintain the confidence and social ease that had become so important to her sense of identity. Margaret's family began to notice changes in her behaviour and appearance, but they had no framework for understanding what was happening to her. Alcoholism as a medical concept barely existed in 1923. Problem drinking was generally understood as a moral failing, a lack of willpower or character that affected primarily men from the lower social classes. The idea that a respectable young woman like Margaret could develop a serious drinking problem seemed absurd to her parents and friends. When Margaret's mother expressed concern about her daughter's frequent headaches and weight loss, Margaret easily deflected these worries by blaming work stress and the demands of her increasingly active social life. When her supervisor at the insurance office questioned her frequent absences and declining work quality, Margaret attributed these problems to a series of minor illnesses and family obligations. The social stigma surrounding excessive drinking actually worked in Margaret's favour, making it easier for her to hide the severity of her problem. Nobody wanted to believe that a nice girl from a good family could be developing the kind of drinking problem associated with degenerate men who frequented low-class saloons. The sophisticated atmosphere of places like the Blue Moon made it seem impossible that anything truly destructive could be happening there. But Margaret's experience was becoming increasingly common throughout Chicago's speakeasy culture. Dr. Harold Winters, who ran a small medical practice on the South Side, began noticing a disturbing pattern among his patients in late 1923 and early 1924. Young men and women from respectable families were coming to his office with symptoms he had never seen before in such concentration. They complained of chronic fatigue, severe headaches, digestive problems, and what they described as nervous exhaustion. They had trouble sleeping, but also trouble staying alert during normal working hours. Many reported episodes of shaking, sweating, and intense anxiety that seemed to occur at random intervals throughout the day. Most puzzling to Dr. Winters, these symptoms seemed to be most severe among his patients who appeared to be leading active, exciting social lives. It took Dr. Winters several months to recognize that what he was seeing were the early stages of alcohol withdrawal and dependency among people who had never been heavy drinkers before Prohibition. The combination of high-proof bootleg liquor, manipulative serving practices, and the psychological pressures of speakeasy culture was creating a new category of alcohol problems that didn't fit existing medical or social understanding. Dr. Winters began keeping detailed records of these cases, documenting how ordinary people were being transformed into alcohol-dependent individuals through their participation in what they believed were sophisticated social activities. His notes from this period provide some of the clearest evidence of how Chicago's speakeasy culture was systematically manufacturing addiction among people who would never have developed drinking problems under the old, regulated saloon system. One of Dr. Winters' patients was a young man named Robert Chen, whose story paralleled Margaret's in disturbing ways. Robert was a bookkeeper at a downtown department store who had begun visiting a speakeasy called the Golden Key after being invited by a co-worker. Like Margaret, Robert initially saw his speakeasy visits as a way to add excitement and sophistication to his otherwise routine life. Robert's speakeasy operated according to the same psychological principles as the Blue Moon, but with some additional features that made it even more effective at creating customer dependency. The Golden Key had developed what they called a membership system, where regular customers could purchase monthly passes that provided access to special events, premium liquors, and reserved seating areas. The membership system created artificial scarcity and social hierarchy that made customers feel they needed to visit frequently to justify their investment and maintain their status within the establishment. Robert found himself attending events at the Golden Key, even when he didn't particularly want to drink, simply because he had paid for membership privileges and felt obligated to use them. More insidiously, the Golden Key tracked customer spending and consumption patterns, using this information to provide what they called personalized service. Bartenders would remember Robert's preferred drinks and have them ready when he arrived. Staff members would greet him by name and ask about his work and personal life. The establishment created the illusion of genuine friendship and community while systematically exploiting Robert's psychological vulnerabilities. Within 6 months of joining the Golden Key, Robert was spending nearly 70% of his income on membership fees, drinks, and related social expenses. He had borrowed money from his family to cover basic living expenses, telling them he was investing in business opportunities that would pay off in the long term. He had started drinking before work to combat the anxiety and depression that overwhelmed him during daytime hours. Like Margaret, Robert had no understanding that his behavior was being deliberately manipulated by people who profited from his increasing dependency on their establishment. From his perspective, he had simply discovered a social environment where he felt appreciated and alive, and he was willing to make financial sacrifices to maintain access to that environment. The tragic irony of Chicago's speakeasy culture was that it promised liberation from the restrictions and moral judgments of conventional society, but it actually created new forms of control that were far more subtle and effective than anything that had existed before Prohibition. The old saloons had been regulated by law, community oversight, and social tradition. The speakeasies were regulated only by the profit motives of criminal entrepreneurs who had discovered that addiction was far more lucrative than simple intoxication. Vincent Torino and operators like him weren't just selling alcohol, they were selling identity, community, and meaning to people who felt disconnected from the rapid social changes transforming American society in the 1920s. But the community they provided was entirely artificial, designed to extract maximum profit from people's deepest psychological needs and vulnerabilities. By the spring of 1924, Margaret had become completely dependent on her nightly visits to the Blue Moon, not just for the alcohol, but for the sense of purpose and belonging that the speakeasy provided. She had lost 15 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and begun experiencing episodes of paranoia and depression that made normal social interaction almost impossible. But she still believed that her problems were temporary, that she was simply going through a difficult period that would resolve itself once she got her life properly organized. She had no way of understanding that she had become trapped in a system specifically designed to prevent people like her from organizing their lives in any way that didn't center around continued consumption of bootleg alcohol. Margaret's story was approaching a crisis point that would force her to confront the reality of what Chicago's speakeasy culture had done to her life. But first, she would have to survive what was about to become the most dangerous night in the Blue Moon's history, a night that would reveal just how far the city's underground drinking establishments were willing to go to protect their profitable operations from the forces that threatened to shut them down. The night that would change everything for Margaret began like any other Friday evening in June of 1924. She had rushed home from work, changed into her best beaded dress, and applied the dark kohl around her eyes that had become her signature look at the Blue Moon. But as she walked down Clark Street toward the familiar flower shop entrance, she noticed something different in the air. There was tension among the people on the sidewalk, hushed conversations between men in expensive coats, and an unusual number of automobiles parked along the street with their engines running. What Margaret didn't know was that Vincent Torino had received word earlier that day that federal agents were planning a major raid on speakeasies throughout the North Side. The information had come through channels that connected Chicago's underground drinking establishments to the broader criminal network that controlled bootlegging operations throughout the city. This network had grown far beyond simple alcohol distribution, evolving into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used speakeasies as front operations for activities that were far more dangerous than illegal drinking. Vincent's response to the raid warning revealed the true nature of what places like the Blue Moon had become. Rather than temporarily closing his establishment or warning his customers about the potential danger, Vincent saw the situation as an opportunity to maximize profits before a possible shutdown. He had learned that customers would pay premium prices and consume dangerous quantities of alcohol when they believed they were participating in especially risky or exclusive events. So Vincent spread word among his regular customers that Friday night would feature a special celebration, a defiant party in the face of government oppression. He implied that federal agents might attempt to interfere with the evening's activities, but assured his customers that he had taken precautions to ensure their safety and the continuation of their good times. What he didn't tell them was that his precautions involved connections to criminal organizations that settled disputes through methods far more violent than anything his customers could imagine. Margaret arrived at the Blue Moon around 8 o'clock and immediately sensed the electric atmosphere that Vincent had orchestrated. The basement was more crowded than she had ever seen it, filled with both regular customers and unfamiliar faces, who carried themselves with the dangerous confidence of professional criminals. The music was louder, the laughter more reckless, and the drinks were being poured with a generosity that seemed almost desperate. Tommy, the charming bootlegger who had become one of Margaret's closest friends at the Blue Moon, greeted her with unusual intensity. He pressed a cocktail into her hands and told her that tonight was going to be special, that they were going to show the federal government what real Americans thought about their attempts to control personal freedom. The drink he gave her was stronger than anything she had consumed before, burning her throat and making her eyes water, but also producing an immediate rush of confidence and euphoria that made the evening's dangers seem exciting rather than threatening. What Margaret couldn't see was that Tommy's role at the Blue Moon had evolved far beyond simple bootlegging. He had become Vincent's primary connection to a criminal network that used speakeasies as distribution points for narcotics, stolen goods, and other illegal services that were far more profitable than alcohol sales. The federal raid that Vincent had been warned about wasn't targeting speakeasies for Volstead Act violations. It was part of a broader investigation into organized crime activities that had been using establishments like the Blue Moon as cover operations. The criminal network that had grown around Chicago's speakeasy culture represented something entirely new in American organized crime. Before Prohibition, criminal enterprises had been primarily local operations focused on specific illegal activities like gambling, prostitution, or labor racketeering. But the enormous profits available through bootlegging had enabled criminals to create citywide and even regional networks that coordinated multiple illegal activities through a sophisticated system of front businesses and corrupt political connections. Speakeasies like the Blue Moon served multiple functions within these criminal networks. They were retail outlets for bootleg alcohol, but they were also recruitment centers where criminals identified potential accomplices among customers who had demonstrated willingness to break federal law. They were money laundering operations that converted illegal profits into seemingly legitimate business income. Most importantly, they were relationship-building centers where criminal operators like Vincent could develop personal connections with customers that could be exploited for various illegal purposes. Margaret had no understanding of these broader criminal connections, but she had unknowingly become valuable to Vincent's operation in ways that went far beyond her weekly alcohol purchases. Her job at the insurance office gave her access to information about businesses, property values, and financial transactions that could be useful for criminal planning. Her social connections among respectable young professionals provided potential cover for illegal activities and recruitment opportunities for new customers. More immediately, Margaret's obvious addiction to the speakeasy environment made her an ideal candidate for what Vincent privately called customer expansion services. He had learned that customers who were psychologically dependent on speakeasy culture could be gradually introduced to additional illegal services and activities, each step seeming like a natural extension of their existing relationship with the establishment. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself drinking more heavily than ever before, consuming cocktails that seemed designed to overwhelm her judgment and self-control. The alcohol was having effects that went beyond simple intoxication, producing a kind of reckless euphoria that made her feel capable of anything and immune to consequences. She was laughing too loudly, dancing too aggressively, and agreeing to suggestions and invitations that her sober mind would have immediately rejected. Around midnight, Vincent approached Margaret personally, something he had never done before during her months of regular attendance at the Blue Moon. He was charming and solicitous, asking about her work and expressing admiration for her sophistication and independence. But there was something in his manner that made Margaret feel both flattered and slightly uncomfortable, as if she were being evaluated for purposes she didn't understand. Vincent suggested that Margaret might be interested in earning additional income by providing occasional assistance with business matters that required the involvement of someone with her professional background and social connections. He was deliberately vague about the specific nature of this assistance, but he implied that it would involve helping respectable businesses navigate the complex regulatory environment created by prohibition laws. Margaret's alcohol-impaired judgment made Vincent's proposal seem reasonable and exciting. She was struggling financially due to her increasing speakeasy expenses, and the idea of earning extra money while helping sophisticated business people seemed like an ideal solution to her problems. She agreed to meet with Vincent the following week to discuss specific opportunities, not understanding that she had just agreed to become involved in criminal activities that could destroy her life in ways that went far beyond addiction. The federal raid that Vincent had been warned about finally materialized around 2 o'clock in the morning, but not in the way that anyone at the Blue Moon had expected. Instead of uniformed agents breaking down doors and arresting customers, the raid took the form of a coordinated surveillance operation that identified key players in the criminal network without alerting them to the investigation. Federal agents positioned outside the Blue Moon and dozens of other speakeasies throughout the city photographed customers entering and leaving the establishments, documented license plate numbers of vehicles used by suspected criminals, and recorded conversations between criminal operators using newly developed electronic surveillance equipment. The goal wasn't to make immediate arrests for Volstead Act violations, but to gather evidence for a comprehensive prosecution of the organized crime network that had grown around Chicago's speakeasy culture. Margaret stumbled out of the Blue Moon around 3 in the morning, her mind reeling from alcohol and her judgment completely compromised by the evening's events. She had no awareness that she had been photographed by federal agents, that her agreement to assist Vincent's business operations had been recorded, or that she had become a person of interest in a federal criminal investigation that would eventually destroy hundreds of lives throughout Chicago's underground drinking scene. The walk home through the empty streets gave Margaret her first opportunity in hours to think clearly, and what she discovered terrified her. She couldn't remember large portions of the evening, couldn't recall exactly what she had agreed to do for Vincent, and couldn't understand why she had consumed so much alcohol that her hands were still shaking and her vision was still blurred. For the first time since she had started visiting the Blue Moon, Margaret began to suspect that something was seriously wrong with her relationship to the speakeasy culture that had become the center of her life. But Margaret's moment of clarity was temporary, overwhelmed by the physical and psychological withdrawal symptoms that began hitting her within hours of leaving the Blue Moon. The headaches, nausea, and anxiety that she had been attributing to work stress and general life pressures were actually symptoms of alcohol withdrawal, her body's response to the absence of the high-proof, bootleg liquor that had become essential to her daily functioning. By Sunday evening, Margaret was desperate to return to the Blue Moon, not for social reasons, but because she had discovered that alcohol was the only thing that could relieve the physical and emotional agony that overwhelmed her whenever she tried to remain sober for more than a few hours. She had crossed a line from psychological dependence to physical addiction, and she no longer had any choice about whether or when she would drink. Vincent Torino understood exactly what was happening to customers like Margaret, and he had designed his operation to exploit their addiction in ways that went far beyond simple alcohol sales. The meeting he had scheduled with Margaret wasn't really about providing her with legitimate business opportunities. It was about recruiting her into criminal activities that would make her completely dependent on his protection and unable to extricate herself from his organization. The criminal network that Vincent represented had discovered that addicted speakeasy customers made ideal accomplices for various illegal schemes. Their need for continued access to alcohol made them willing to take risks and perform services that they would never have considered under normal circumstances. Their respectable social backgrounds provided perfect cover for criminal activities that required interaction with legitimate businesses and institutions. Most importantly, their addiction created a form of control that was far more effective than traditional criminal coercion. Vincent didn't need to threaten Margaret with violence to ensure her cooperation. He simply needed to control her access to the alcohol and social environment that had become essential to her psychological and physical survival. Margaret's story was being replicated throughout Chicago's speakeasy network, creating a population of middle-class addicts who were systematically being recruited into criminal activities through their dependence on illegal alcohol and the social environments that surrounded its distribution. These weren't the traditional criminal associates that law enforcement agencies were trained to recognize and investigate. They were ordinary citizens whose addiction had made them vulnerable to exploitation by sophisticated criminal organizations. Dr. Harold Winters had begun documenting this phenomenon in his medical practice, but he was struggling to convince other medical professionals and law enforcement officials that a new category of crime victim was emerging from Chicago's speakeasy culture. The social stigma surrounding addiction made it difficult for people like Margaret to seek help, while the sophisticated nature of the criminal exploitation made it difficult for authorities to recognize what was happening. The federal investigation that had begun with surveillance of establishments like the Blue Moon was starting to reveal the true scope of the criminal network that had grown around Chicago's Prohibition-era drinking culture. What had appeared to be simple violations of alcohol laws was actually a comprehensive criminal enterprise that had corrupted legitimate businesses, political institutions, and thousands of individual lives throughout the city. Margaret's meeting with Vincent was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and she spent the intervening days in a state of increasing anxiety and confusion about what she had committed herself to. Her addiction made it impossible for her to stay away from the Blue Moon long enough to think clearly about her situation. But her few moments of sobriety were filled with growing dread about the direction her life was taking. The speakeasy culture that had promised liberation and sophistication had become a prison that controlled every aspect of her existence. She could no longer function at work without alcohol, could no longer maintain relationships with family and friends who weren't part of the underground drinking scene, and could no longer imagine a future that didn't revolve around her nightly visits to Vincent's basement establishment. Tuesday evening arrived with the weight of inevitability, and Margaret found herself walking once again toward the flower shop entrance that had become the gateway to a world she no longer understood or controlled. She was about to discover that her addiction to Chicago's speakeasy culture had made her a participant in criminal activities that would ultimately destroy not just her own life, but the lives of countless other people who had been drawn into the web of organized crime that had grown around the city's underground drinking establishments. As Margaret approached the flower shop that Tuesday evening, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were fewer people on the street than usual, and the men who were there seemed to be watching everything with unusual intensity. She almost turned around and went home, but the physical craving for alcohol had become so overwhelming that the thought of spending another night in her apartment, shaking and sweating and feeling like her skin was crawling with invisible insects, was unbearable. The elderly woman arranging roses barely looked up as Margaret passed through the shop, but something in her manner suggested that she knew exactly what was about to happen downstairs. Margaret descended the familiar wooden steps, but instead of the usual jazz music and laughter, she heard voices engaged in what sounded like serious business discussions. The atmosphere in the Blue Moon had changed completely since Friday night. Vincent was waiting for her at a corner table, dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, with two other men she didn't recognize. One was tall and thin, with cold eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance. The other was shorter, stockier, with the kind of hands that suggested he was accustomed to physical work, though his expensive suit indicated that his current occupation was far more lucrative than manual labour. Vincent stood as she approached, displaying the kind of old-world courtesy that had always made him seem sophisticated and trustworthy. He introduced the other men as business associates, Mr. Castellano and Mr. Murphy, who were interested in discussing opportunities that might benefit someone with Margaret's particular skills and social connections. The conversation that followed would have seemed completely innocent to any casual observer. They talked about the challenges facing legitimate businesses in the current regulatory environment, about the difficulties of maintaining proper insurance coverage and financial documentation when normal business relationships had been disrupted by federal legislation. They expressed admiration for Margaret's work at the insurance office and suggested that her expertise could be valuable to businesses trying to navigate these complex challenges. But as the evening progressed and the drinks continued to flow, the true nature of what they were proposing became increasingly clear. They needed someone with access to insurance records who could provide information about businesses that were struggling financially, properties that were underinsured, and individuals who might be vulnerable to various forms of financial pressure. They needed someone whose respectable appearance and legitimate employment would provide cover for activities that required interaction with banks, law offices, and other institutions that had become suspicious of obvious criminal associates. Margaret's alcohol-impaired mind struggled to process the implications of what she was hearing. Part of her understood that she was being recruited for criminal activities, but another part of her was fascinated by the sophistication of the operation and flattered by the suggestion that her skills were valuable to such obviously successful men. The combination of alcohol, addiction, and her desperate need to maintain her connection to the speakeasy environment made it almost impossible for her to think clearly about the consequences of what she was agreeing to. Mr. Castellano explained that their organization had developed relationships with businesses throughout Chicago that needed assistance with various regulatory and financial challenges. Some of these businesses were struggling to obtain proper insurance coverage due to their association with activities that insurance companies considered risky. Others needed help documenting financial transactions in ways that would satisfy federal investigators without revealing information that might be used against them. Margaret's role would be to provide information that would help their organization identify opportunities to assist these businesses, and occasionally to use her position at the insurance office to facilitate documentation that would be beneficial to their clients. In return, she would receive compensation that would easily cover her speakeasy expenses and provide additional income for other purposes. The proposal was presented in language that made it sound like legitimate business consulting, but Margaret's few moments of clarity allowed her to understand that she was being asked to participate in insurance fraud, money laundering, and the systematic exploitation of financially vulnerable businesses. She was being recruited to become a criminal, but the recruitment process was so gradual and so carefully disguised that it felt like she was simply accepting a better job opportunity. Her addiction made the decision inevitable. She needed continued access to the Blue Moon and the alcohol it provided, and Vincent had made it clear that such access would depend on her willingness to assist his business operations. She agreed to provide the information they requested, telling herself that she was simply helping legitimate businesses deal with unreasonable government regulations. What Margaret didn't understand was that her recruitment represented just one small part of a criminal enterprise that had grown far beyond anything that had existed before Prohibition. The organization that Vincent represented had systematically identified and recruited dozens of people in similar positions throughout Chicago, creating a network of legitimate employees who could provide information and services that would have been impossible for obvious criminals to obtain. The insurance fraud scheme that Margaret was joining had already victimized hundreds of businesses throughout the city. The organization would identify companies that were struggling financially, then arrange for suspicious fires, thefts, or accidents that would trigger insurance claims. Margaret's job was to provide information that would help them select targets and to facilitate the processing of fraudulent claims through her position at the insurance office. But the insurance fraud was just one component of a much larger criminal operation. The same network was involved in labor racketeering, using information provided by recruited employees to identify businesses that could be pressured into paying protection money or hiring workers from criminal-controlled unions. They were running gambling operations out of supposedly legitimate businesses, using employees like Margaret to provide information about which establishments had sufficient cash flow to support such activities without attracting unwanted attention. Most lucratively, they were using their network of legitimate employees to facilitate narcotics throughout Chicago, the distribution of NAR's business district. Drugs were being stored in office buildings, distributed through seemingly innocent business transactions, and sold to customers who could never have been reached through traditional criminal channels. Margaret left the Blue Moon that night with a list of specific information that Vincent wanted her to obtain from insurance records, along with instructions for how to communicate with his organization without using the Speakeasy as an intermediary. She had been given a telephone number that connected to what appeared to be a legitimate import business, and code words that would allow her to request meetings or provide information without explicitly discussing illegal activities. The transformation from Speakeasy customer to criminal accomplice had been so gradual and so carefully orchestrated that Margaret still didn't fully understand what had happened to her. She told herself that she was simply providing consulting services to sophisticated businessmen who appreciated her expertise and were willing to pay well for it. But deep down, she knew that she had crossed a line that would be impossible to cross back. The information that Margaret began providing to Vincent's organization had immediate and devastating consequences for businesses throughout Chicago. Within 2 weeks of her first intelligence report, 3 companies that she had identified as underinsured suffered mysterious fires that destroyed their facilities and inventory. The insurance claims totaled more than $50,000, money that came directly from the legitimate insurance pool that protected all policyholders in the city. But Margaret never saw the direct connection between the information she provided and the crimes that followed. The organization had carefully compartmentalized its operations so that individual participants like Margaret only understood their specific role, never the broader criminal enterprise they were supporting. This compartmentalization made it easier for participants to rationalize their involvement and harder for law enforcement to prosecute the entire network, even if they managed to arrest individual members. The psychological impact of Margaret's criminal involvement was far more severe than she had anticipated. The guilt and anxiety that accompanied her new activities drove her to drink even more heavily, creating a vicious cycle where her need for alcohol made her more dependent on Vincent's organization, while her participation in criminal activities created emotional distress that could only be numbed through additional alcohol consumption. Dr. Harold Winters began seeing Margaret as a patient in August of 1924, though she came to him under the pretense of seeking treatment for what she described as nervous exhaustion and digestive problems. Dr. Winters immediately recognized the symptoms of advanced alcohol addiction, but Margaret was so deeply embedded in the criminal network that she was terrified to discuss the true source of her problems. Dr. Winters' notes from this period reveal the devastating impact that Chicago's speakeasy culture was having on individuals who had started as ordinary citizens seeking social entertainment. Margaret had lost more than 25 pounds since she first visited the Blue Moon. Her hands shook constantly, and she experienced episodes of paranoia and depression that made normal social interaction almost impossible. More troubling to Dr. Winters was Margaret's obvious involvement in activities that were causing her severe psychological distress, but that she was unable or unwilling to discuss. She would become agitated whenever he asked about her work or social activities, and she seemed to be living in constant fear of consequences that she couldn't or wouldn't explain. Dr. Winters suspected that Margaret's problems were connected to the criminal networks that he knew had grown around Chicago's speakeasy culture, but he had no way to help her without understanding the specific nature of her involvement. The medical profession in 1924 had virtually no experience treating patients whose addiction had led them into criminal activities, and there were no social services or legal protections available for people who wanted to extricate themselves from such situations. Margaret's criminal activities were escalating in ways that she couldn't control or predict. Vincent's organization had discovered that she had access not just to insurance records, but to information about the personal finances and business relationships of insurance customers throughout Chicago. They began pressuring her to provide information that could be used for blackmail, extortion, and other forms of financial exploitation. The requests became increasingly specific and obviously criminal. Vincent wanted detailed information about wealthy individuals who were having financial difficulties, businesses that were vulnerable to labor disruption, and professionals who might be susceptible to various forms of coercion. Margaret understood that she was providing information that would be used to destroy lives and livelihoods, but her addiction made it impossible for her to refuse these requests. The federal investigation that had begun with surveillance of establishments like the Blue Moon was slowly uncovering the true scope of the criminal network that had grown around Chicago's Prohibition-era drinking culture. Federal agents had identified more than 200 legitimate employees throughout the city who appeared to be providing information or services to criminal organizations, though they hadn't yet understood the systematic nature of the recruitment process. Margaret's name appeared on federal surveillance lists as early as September 1924, when agents photographed her entering and leaving Vincent's legitimate import business during what appeared to be a professional meeting. Federal investigators were beginning to understand that the criminal networks they were tracking had developed sophisticated methods for recruiting and controlling accomplices who had no previous criminal history. The psychological techniques that criminal organizations like Vincent's used to control their recruited accomplices were far more sophisticated than traditional criminal coercion. Instead of relying on threats of violence, they created systems of dependence that made it almost impossible for accomplices to extricate themselves without losing everything they had come to depend on for psychological and physical survival. Margaret's addiction to alcohol was just one component of her dependence on Vincent's organization. She had also become psychologically dependent on the social environment of the Blue Moon, financially dependent on the income she received for providing information, and emotionally dependent on the sense of importance and sophistication that came from being part of what she still believed was a legitimate business operation. Vincent and his associates had carefully studied the psychological vulnerabilities of people like Margaret, learning to exploit their need for social acceptance, financial security, and personal significance in ways that made traditional criminal recruitment techniques seem crude and ineffective. They understood that middle-class professionals could be controlled more effectively through manipulation of their legitimate needs and desires than through threats of physical violence. The criminal network had also developed sophisticated methods for protecting their recruited accomplices from law enforcement scrutiny. Margaret's activities were carefully structured so that any individual transaction appeared legitimate, even though the cumulative effect was clearly criminal. If she were arrested and investigated, it would be difficult for prosecutors to prove criminal intent based on any single action she had taken. More importantly, the organization had developed relationships with corrupt officials throughout Chicago's legal and political system who could provide advance warning of investigations and influence the outcomes of criminal prosecutions. Margaret and other recruited accomplices were protected not just by the sophistication of their criminal activities, but by a comprehensive system of corruption that made successful prosecution extremely difficult. By the fall of 1924, Margaret had become so deeply embedded in Vincent's criminal organization that she could no longer distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate activities. She was providing information that was being used for insurance fraud, extortion, labor racketeering, and narcotics distribution. But the compartmentalized nature of her involvement allowed her to rationalize each individual action as a reasonable business service. The psychological compartmentalization that allowed Margaret to function as a criminal accomplice while maintaining her self-image as a respectable professional was itself a form of psychological damage caused by her addiction and criminal involvement. She had developed what would later be recognized as a form of dissociative disorder, where different aspects of her life existed in separate mental compartments that didn't communicate with each other. During working hours at the insurance office, Margaret could function as a competent professional who genuinely believed she was serving the legitimate interests of her employer and customers. During her meetings with Vincent's organization, she could function as a criminal accomplice who provided information and services that she knew were being used for illegal purposes. During her evenings at the Blue Moon, she could function as a social butterfly who was simply enjoying the sophisticated pleasures of Chicago's underground culture. The compartmentalization was breaking down as the criminal demands on Margaret increased, and her addiction progressed to the point where she could no longer maintain normal professional functions. She was making mistakes at work that threatened to expose her criminal activities, while her criminal activities were becoming so extensive that they threatened to overwhelm her ability to maintain her legitimate employment. Dr. Winters documented the psychological deterioration that he observed in Margaret during the fall of 1924, though he still didn't understand the specific causes of her distress. She was experiencing what he described as episodes of acute anxiety, accompanied by paranoid ideation, periods of depression so severe that she seemed almost catatonic, and physical symptoms that suggested her body was being systematically poisoned by substances she was consuming regularly. The bootleg alcohol that Margaret was consuming at the Blue Moon was indeed poisoning her, but not in the way that Dr. Winters suspected. Vincent's suppliers had begun adulterating their products with industrial chemicals that were cheaper than traditional alcohol but far more toxic to human physiology. The methanol, lead compounds, and other industrial additives that were being used to stretch bootleg alcohol supplies were causing neurological damage that manifested as the psychological symptoms that Dr. Winters was observing. Margaret's physical addiction to alcohol had become complicated by her body's adaptation to these toxic additives, creating withdrawal symptoms that were far more severe than anything associated with traditional alcohol dependence. When she tried to remain sober for more than a few hours, she experienced not just the usual anxiety and physical discomfort, but episodes of violent trembling, hallucinations, and cardiovascular irregularities that made her fear she was dying. The toxic effects of bootleg alcohol were being experienced by thousands of people throughout Chicago's speakeasy culture, but the symptoms were so varied and so poorly understood that medical professionals rarely connected them to alcohol consumption. Many patients were being diagnosed with various forms of nervous exhaustion, industrial poisoning, or exotic infectious diseases when they were actually suffering from the cumulative effects of consuming chemically adulterated bootleg liquor. Vincent's organization was well aware of the toxic effects of the alcohol they were serving, but they viewed customer health problems as an acceptable cost of doing business. Sick customers were often more dependent customers, and the criminal organization had discovered that people who were suffering from the physical and psychological effects of toxic alcohol consumption were more willing to participate in criminal activities that might provide access to better quality substances. Margaret's criminal activities reached a turning point in November of 1924, when Vincent asked her to provide information that would be used to target a specific business for what he described as a comprehensive restructuring opportunity. The business was a small manufacturing company that employed more than 50 people and provided the primary source of income for families throughout a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's West Side. Vincent's plan involved using information about the company's insurance coverage, financial obligations, and labor relationships to orchestrate a series of problems that would force the owners to accept a partnership agreement with his organization. The plan included arson, labor disruption, supplier intimidation, and customer harassment that would systematically destroy the company's ability to operate independently. Margaret understood that providing the requested information would make her directly responsible for the destruction of a legitimate business and the economic devastation of dozens of families who depended on that business for their survival. For the first time since she had begun working with Vincent's organization, she was being asked to participate in an activity where the criminal intent and devastating consequences were impossible to rationalize or ignore. The request forced Margaret to confront the reality of what she had become and what her addiction had led her to do. She was no longer a respectable professional who occasionally provided consulting services to sophisticated businessmen. She was a criminal accomplice whose actions were directly contributing to the systematic destruction of Chicago's legitimate business community. But her addiction made it almost impossible for her to refuse Vincent's request. She needed continued access to the Blue Moon and the alcohol it provided, and she had become financially dependent on the income she received from her criminal activities. More importantly, she had become psychologically dependent on the sense of importance and sophistication that came from being part of Vincent's organization, even though she now understood that the organization was fundamentally criminal. The psychological trap that Vincent's organization had created for Margaret was perfect in its cruelty. Her addiction had made her dependent on continued participation in criminal activities, while her participation in criminal activities had created psychological trauma that could only be numbed through additional alcohol consumption. She was trapped in a cycle where the only solution to the problems caused by her criminal involvement was deeper criminal involvement. Margaret's story was being replicated throughout Chicago's criminal network, creating a population of middle-class accomplices who were systematically being destroyed by their involvement in activities they had never intended to participate in. The speakeasy culture that had promised liberation and sophistication had become a recruitment system for criminal organizations that needed legitimate employees to facilitate their illegal activities. The federal investigation that had been slowly building evidence against Chicago's criminal networks was approaching a climactic phase that would expose the true scope of the corruption that had grown around the city's Prohibition-era drinking culture. Federal agents had identified the systematic recruitment of legitimate employees, documented the comprehensive nature of the criminal activities being facilitated through speakeasies, and developed evidence that could be used to prosecute hundreds of people throughout the city. But Margaret, and thousands of other people like her, were about to discover that their involvement in these criminal networks had made them targets of federal prosecution rather than victims of criminal exploitation. The same addiction that had made them vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations had also made them accomplices to crimes that carried severe federal penalties. The night when everything would finally collapse for Margaret was approaching with the inevitability of a natural disaster. And neither she nor the thousands of other people who had been drawn into Chicago's underground criminal economy had any idea how completely their lives were about to be destroyed by forces they had never understood or anticipated. The catastrophic night that would expose the full horror of Chicago's speakeasy addiction crisis began with what seemed like a celebration. On December 15, 1924, Vincent Torino announced to his regular customers that the Blue Moon would be hosting a special winter gala, complete with live entertainment from New York and premium imported liquor that had supposedly been smuggled directly from European distilleries. Margaret arrived that evening, wearing a new dress she had purchased with money earned from her criminal activities, though she had convinced herself it was simply compensation for legitimate consulting work. The basement was decorated with elaborate Christmas ornaments and filled with more people than she had ever seen there before. The atmosphere was intoxicating in ways that went beyond the alcohol being served. What Margaret and the other customers didn't know was that Vincent's winter gala was actually a desperate attempt to generate maximum revenue before federal agents moved to shut down his operation permanently. The premium imported liquor he had promised was actually the most toxic batch of bootleg alcohol his suppliers had ever produced, adulterated with industrial chemicals that would prove fatal to several customers before the night was over. Vincent had learned 3 days earlier that federal investigators had obtained warrants for his arrest and the seizure of all his properties. Rather than flee the city or attempt to negotiate with authorities, he had decided to orchestrate one final night of maximum profit extraction from the customers whose addiction he had spent months cultivating and exploiting. The alcohol being served that night contained levels of methanol and lead compounds that would have been immediately fatal if consumed in normal quantities. But Vincent's bartenders had been instructed to serve drinks that were gradually increased in toxicity throughout the evening, allowing customers to consume lethal doses over several hours without immediately recognizing the danger. Margaret's first cocktail of the evening tasted unusually harsh, burning her throat and producing an immediate sensation of dizziness that was more intense than anything she had experienced before. But the psychological effects were also more powerful than usual, creating a sense of euphoria and confidence that made her feel invulnerable to any consequences or dangers. By 10 o'clock, Margaret was consuming drinks that were essentially poison disguised as premium liquor. Her body was absorbing chemicals that were systematically destroying her liver, kidneys, and nervous system. But the immediate psychological effects were so powerful that she felt better than she had in months. Other customers were experiencing similar effects, but some were beginning to show symptoms that revealed the true nature of what they were consuming. A young man named Peter Kowalski, who worked as a clerk at a downtown bank, collapsed near the bar around 11 o'clock, his body convulsing violently as industrial chemicals overwhelmed his nervous system. Instead of calling for medical assistance, Vincent's staff dragged Peter to a back room where he died within minutes. Vincent's response to Peter's death revealed the complete moral bankruptcy that had developed within Chicago's criminal speakeasy culture. Rather than stopping the service of toxic alcohol or warning his customers about the danger, Vincent instructed his staff to remove Peter's body through a hidden tunnel that connected the Blue Moon to the city's sewer system, then continue serving drinks as if nothing had happened. Margaret was too intoxicated to notice Peter's collapse or the staff's efforts to conceal what had happened, but her body was beginning to experience the early stages of the same toxic poisoning that had killed him. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably, her vision was becoming blurred, and she was experiencing episodes of nausea that she attributed to excitement about the evening's festivities. Around midnight, Vincent approached Margaret with what he described as an urgent business matter that required immediate attention. He explained that federal agents were planning to raid several legitimate businesses the following week, and he needed her to provide information that would help his organization protect their clients from government harassment. Vincent's request was more specific and obviously criminal than anything he had asked of Margaret before. He wanted detailed information about the personal finances and business relationships of specific individuals who were customers of her insurance company, along with copies of confidential documents that could be used for blackmail and extortion purposes. Margaret's alcohol-poisoned mind was barely capable of understanding what Vincent was asking, but some part of her consciousness recognized that she was being pressured to commit crimes that would destroy the lives of innocent people. For the first time since she had begun working with Vincent's organization, she attempted to refuse his request. Vincent's response revealed the true nature of the control he exercised over customers like Margaret. He explained calmly that her continued access to the Blue Moon and other establishments in his network depended on her willingness to provide the information he requested. He also mentioned that he had detailed records of all her previous criminal activities, records that could be provided to federal investigators if she chose to terminate their business relationship. The threat was delivered with the same sophisticated courtesy that had originally attracted Margaret to Vincent's organization, but the underlying message was clear. She was no longer a customer, or even a willing accomplice. She was a slave whose addiction and criminal involvement had made her completely subject to Vincent's control. Margaret's toxic intoxication made it impossible for her to think clearly about the implications of Vincent's threat or the consequences of complying with his demands. She agreed to provide the information he requested, not because she wanted to participate in additional criminal activities, but because her alcohol-poisoned brain was incapable of formulating any alternative response. What Margaret didn't understand was that Vincent's threats were largely empty. The federal investigation that was closing in on his organization had already identified Margaret and dozens of other recruited accomplices, and Vincent's criminal records would provide no additional information that investigators didn't already possess. Vincent was using Margaret's fear and addiction to extract final services from her before abandoning his Chicago operations entirely. By 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 more customers had died from toxic alcohol poisoning, and several others were experiencing symptoms that would prove fatal within hours. Vincent's staff continued removing bodies through the hidden tunnel system, while bartenders continued serving drinks that were becoming increasingly lethal as the evening progressed. Margaret was among the customers who were still conscious and mobile, but her body was systematically shutting down as industrial chemicals destroyed her internal organs. She was experiencing hallucinations that made it difficult to distinguish between reality and alcohol-induced fantasies. while her physical coordination had deteriorated to the point where she could barely walk without assistance. The end came suddenly around 4 in the morning, when federal agents finally executed their warrants and raided the Blue Moon, along with more than 30 other criminal establishments throughout Chicago. What they discovered was a scene of carnage that exceeded anything they had anticipated from their investigation of prohibition violations. The basement of the Blue Moon contained 17 bodies in various stages of toxic alcohol poisoning, along with more than 40 customers who were unconscious or barely conscious from consuming chemically adulterated bootleg liquor. Margaret was found in a corner booth, still clutching a cocktail glass, her body convulsing from the effects of methanol poisoning. Federal agents immediately called for medical assistance, but the toxic effects of the alcohol that customers had consumed were so severe that conventional medical treatment was largely ineffective. Margaret and most of the other surviving customers were transported to Chicago General Hospital, where doctors struggled to treat patients who were suffering from multiple organ failure caused by industrial chemical poisoning. Dr. Harold Winters was among the medical professionals who responded to the mass poisoning incident at the Blue Moon, and he finally understood the true scope of the medical crisis that had been developing within Chicago's speakeasy culture. The patients he examined weren't just suffering from alcohol addiction. They were victims of systematic poisoning by criminal organizations that had deliberately adulterated bootleg liquor with toxic industrial chemicals. Margaret survived the immediate effects of the methanol poisoning, but her body had been so severely damaged by months of consuming toxic bootleg alcohol that her long-term prognosis was grim. Her liver was failing, her kidneys were barely functional, and her nervous system had been permanently damaged by lead compounds and other industrial chemicals. More devastating than her physical condition was the psychological trauma that resulted from her sudden realization of how completely she had been manipulated and exploited by Vincent's organization. Margaret finally understood that her addiction had been deliberately cultivated and maintained by criminals who viewed her as nothing more than a source of profit and a tool for committing additional crimes. The federal investigation that followed the Blue Moon raid revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise that had grown around Chicago's Prohibition-era drinking culture. Vincent Torino's organization was just one component of a citywide network that had systematically recruited hundreds of legitimate employees to facilitate crimes ranging from insurance fraud to narcotics distribution. Margaret's criminal activities had contributed to the destruction of dozens of legitimate businesses and the financial devastation of hundreds of families throughout Chicago. The information she had provided had been used to orchestrate arson attacks, labor disputes, and extortion schemes that had caused millions of dollars in economic damage to the city's business community. But Margaret was also recognized as a victim of criminal exploitation, someone whose addiction had been deliberately created and maintained by sophisticated criminals who understood how to manipulate human psychology for profit. The federal prosecutors who reviewed her case struggled to determine whether she should be treated primarily as a criminal accomplice or as a victim of organized crime. The legal proceedings that followed the Blue Moon raid exposed the inadequacy of existing law enforcement and medical systems to deal with the new categories of crime and addiction that had emerged from Prohibition-era criminal culture. Margaret and hundreds of other recruited accomplices existed in a legal grey area where traditional concepts of criminal responsibility didn't adequately address the reality of their exploitation. Margaret spent 6 months in federal custody while prosecutors decided how to handle her case. During this period, she experienced severe withdrawal symptoms from both alcohol and the toxic chemicals that had become part of her physiological dependency. The medical treatment she received was primitive by later standards, consisting primarily of sedation and basic nutritional support. The psychological treatment available to Margaret was virtually non-existent. The concept of addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing was still decades away from widespread acceptance, and there were no therapeutic interventions designed to help people recover from the kind of systematic criminal exploitation she had experienced. Vincent Torino disappeared during the federal raids and was never apprehended by law enforcement authorities. Federal investigators suspected that he had fled to Europe using false identification documents, taking with him profits estimated at more than $2 million that had been extracted from Chicago's speakeasy culture over a period of less than 2 years. The criminal network that Vincent had helped create continued operating under different leadership, adapting to increased federal enforcement by developing even more sophisticated methods for recruiting and controlling legitimate accomplices. The systematic exploitation of addiction for criminal purposes had proven so profitable that it became a permanent feature of organized crime operations throughout the United States. Margaret was eventually released from federal custody without being formally prosecuted, but her life had been irreparably damaged by her involvement with Chicago's speakeasy culture. Her physical health never recovered from the toxic effects of bootleg alcohol consumption, and she suffered from neurological problems that affected her ability to work and maintain normal social relationships. More tragically, Margaret's psychological recovery was complicated by her continued craving for the social environment and sense of importance that she had experienced during her involvement with Vincent's organization. Even after understanding how completely she had been manipulated and exploited, she continued to romanticize the sophistication and excitement of the speakeasy culture that had destroyed her life. Dr. Harold Winters continued treating Margaret and other victims of Chicago's speakeasy culture for several years after the Blue Moon raid, documenting the long-term physical and psychological effects of toxic alcohol consumption and criminal exploitation. His medical records from this period provide some of the most detailed evidence of how Prohibition-era criminal culture systematically destroyed the lives of ordinary citizens. Dr. Winter's observations revealed that the addiction created by Chicago's speakeasy culture was fundamentally different from traditional forms of alcohol dependency. Patients like Margaret had become addicted not just to alcohol, but to an entire social and criminal environment that provided meaning, excitement, and identity in ways that conventional society could not match. The criminal organizations that operated Chicago's speakeasies had discovered that they could create more profound and lasting forms of dependency by manipulating people's psychological needs for social acceptance, personal significance, and escape from the routine pressures of modern urban life. Traditional alcohol addiction affected people's physiology, but speakeasy addiction affected their entire sense of identity and purpose. Margaret's attempts to rebuild her life after her release from federal custody were complicated by her inability to find satisfaction in legitimate social environments that seemed boring and meaningless compared to the artificial excitement of the speakeasy culture. She struggled with depression, anxiety, and a persistent sense that her real life had ended when the Blue Moon was shut down. The economic impact of Margaret's criminal activities continued affecting Chicago's business community long after her arrest. The insurance fraud schemes she had facilitated resulted in increased premiums for all policyholders, while the businesses that had been targeted for criminal exploitation often never recovered from the damage they had suffered. Margaret's story was replicated in thousands of other lives throughout Chicago and other major American cities, where similar criminal networks had emerged around Prohibition-era drinking culture. The systematic recruitment and exploitation of middle-class professionals created a hidden population of crime victims whose suffering was largely invisible to law enforcement authorities and social service agencies. The federal investigation that began with surveillance of establishments like the Blue Moon eventually resulted in the prosecution of more than 300 individuals throughout Chicago, but the criminal networks they had been part of quickly adapted to increased enforcement by developing more sophisticated methods of operation. The toxic alcohol that had nearly killed Margaret and had killed dozens of other customers at speakeasies throughout the city represented just one aspect of the public health crisis created by prohibition policies. Criminal organizations had discovered that deliberately adulterating bootleg alcohol with industrial chemicals increased their profit margins while creating more dependent customers who were willing to pay premium prices for access to supposedly higher quality products. The methanol, lead compounds, and other industrial additives that were routinely used in bootleg alcohol production caused neurological damage, liver failure, kidney dysfunction, and other medical conditions that affected thousands of people throughout Chicago's drinking population. Many of these health problems weren't immediately recognized as alcohol-related, leading to misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatment that often made the underlying conditions worse. Margaret's medical records from the months following her release from federal custody document the progressive deterioration that affected many survivors of toxic alcohol poisoning. Her liver function continued declining, her neurological symptoms worsened, and she developed cardiovascular problems that were directly related to the industrial chemicals she had consumed during her months of regular speakeasy attendance. The psychological trauma that Margaret experienced as a result of understanding how completely she had been manipulated and exploited was complicated by her continued craving for the social environment that had been created around her addiction. She missed the sophisticated atmosphere of the Blue Moon, the sense of being part of an exclusive social circle, and the feeling of importance that had come from her involvement in what she had believed were legitimate business activities. Dr. Winters documented similar psychological patterns among other patients who had been involved with Chicago's speakeasy culture, noting that their recovery was often complicated by their continued romanticization of the criminal environment that had exploited them. Many patients expressed nostalgia for the excitement and sophistication of their speakeasy experiences, even while acknowledging that those experiences had nearly destroyed their lives. The social stigma associated with addiction and criminal involvement made it difficult for people like Margaret to obtain employment or rebuild relationships with family members who had been damaged by their involvement with criminal organizations. Margaret's parents had been forced to mortgage their home to pay for her medical treatment, while her siblings had suffered social embarrassment that affected their own career prospects and marriage opportunities. Margaret's attempts to find legitimate employment were complicated by her criminal record and her ongoing health problems, both of which were direct results of her involvement with Vincent's organization. Employers were reluctant to hire someone who had been involved in federal criminal investigations, while her neurological problems made it difficult for her to perform the kind of detailed office work that had been her primary professional skill. The economic consequences of Margaret's speakeasy addiction extended far beyond her personal financial losses. Her criminal activities had contributed to insurance fraud schemes that ultimately cost Chicago's business community millions of dollars, while her inability to maintain steady employment after her release from custody meant that she became dependent on charity and family support that strained the resources of people who had already been victimized by her criminal involvement. Margaret's story illustrates the comprehensive nature of the destruction caused by Chicago's Prohibition-era criminal culture. What had begun as innocent social drinking had evolved into systematic criminal exploitation that destroyed not just individual lives, but entire networks of family relationships, business connections, and community institutions. The speakeasy culture that had promised liberation from the restrictions of conventional society had actually created new forms of control that were far more comprehensive and destructive than anything that had existed under the legal saloon system. Criminal organizations like Vincent's had developed methods for manipulating human psychology that created dependencies so profound that victims continued craving their exploitation even after understanding its true nature. Margaret lived for 7 more years after her release from federal custody, but her life was defined by the physical and psychological damage caused by her involvement with Chicago's speakeasy culture. She never married, never held steady employment, and never recovered from the health problems caused by toxic alcohol consumption and the trauma of understanding how completely she had been manipulated and exploited. Margaret died in 1931 at the age of 32. Her death certificate listing liver failure as the immediate cause, but making no mention of the toxic bootleg alcohol consumption that had destroyed her liver years earlier. Her death was recorded as a routine medical event, with no recognition that she had been a victim of one of the most systematic and destructive criminal enterprises in American history. Dr. Harold Winters conducted an unofficial autopsy that revealed the extent of the physical damage that Margaret had suffered during her involvement with Chicago's speakeasy culture. Her liver was essentially non-functional. Her kidneys showed severe scarring from industrial chemical exposure, and her brain tissue showed evidence of permanent neurological damage consistent with chronic methanol poisoning. Margaret's funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen people, most of them family members who had been financially and emotionally devastated by her criminal involvement. None of her former associates from the Blue Moon attended, and there was no recognition that her death represented the final chapter in a story of criminal exploitation that had affected thousands of lives throughout Chicago. The criminal organizations that had recruited and exploited Margaret continued operating long after her death, adapting their methods to changing legal and social conditions, but maintaining their focus on identifying and manipulating people whose psychological vulnerabilities made them suitable targets for systematic exploitation. Margaret's story was never told in the newspapers that covered Chicago's Prohibition-era crime problems, and her name never appeared in the historical accounts that documented the period's major criminal figures and events. She died as anonymously as she had lived after her involvement with Vincent's organization, another invisible victim of a criminal culture that had systematically destroyed thousands of lives while generating enormous profits for its operators. The speakeasy addiction that had consumed Margaret's life represented just one component of a comprehensive transformation of American criminal culture that occurred during the Prohibition era. The illegal alcohol trade had created opportunities for criminal innovation and expansion that fundamentally changed the nature of organized crime in the United States, creating systems of exploitation that continued affecting American society long after the repeal of prohibition laws. Margaret Sullivan's story remains buried in the medical records of Dr. Harold Winters and the federal investigation files that documented the criminal network she had been part of. But her experience illustrates the human cost of policy decisions that created unintended opportunities for criminal exploitation of ordinary citizens whose only crime was seeking escape from the pressures and limitations of modern urban life. The sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that criminal organizations developed during the Prohibition era became permanent features of organized crime operations, while the systematic recruitment of legitimate employees for criminal purposes became a standard method for criminal enterprises seeking to expand their operations and protect themselves from law enforcement scrutiny. Chicago's speakeasy culture had promised freedom, sophistication, and escape from conventional social restrictions. But for people like Margaret Sullivan, it delivered systematic exploitation, physical poisoning, and psychological manipulation that destroyed their lives while generating enormous profits for criminal organizations that understood exactly how to monetize human vulnerability and desperation. The romantic image of Prohibition-era speakeasies that persists in American popular culture bears no resemblance to the reality that Margaret and thousands of other victims experienced. The jazz music, sophisticated cocktails, and rebellious atmosphere were carefully constructed facades designed to conceal systematic criminal exploitation that was more comprehensive and destructive than anything that had existed in American society before or since. Margaret's death in 1931 marked the end of one individual story of destruction, but the criminal methods and psychological manipulation techniques that had destroyed her life continued evolving and spreading throughout American organized crime. The speakeasy addiction crisis that had consumed Chicago during the 1920s had created innovations in criminal exploitation that would continue affecting American society for generations to come. The legacy of Margaret's story extended far beyond her individual tragedy, weaving itself into the fabric of a city that was systematically transforming ordinary citizens into casualties of criminal enterprise. While Margaret lay dying in a charity hospital bed, hundreds of other stories were unfolding across Chicago's neighborhoods. each following the same devastating pattern of recruitment, exploitation, and destruction. Thomas Brady was a 30-year-old accountant for a respected law firm downtown when he first encountered the criminal network that had consumed Margaret's life. Unlike Margaret's gradual descent into speakeasy culture, Thomas's introduction came through what appeared to be a legitimate business opportunity. In March of 1925, just months after the Blue Moon raid, Thomas received an invitation to attend a private business gathering at an establishment called the Golden Circle. The invitation came from a client of his law firm, a well-dressed businessman named Arthur Castellano, who claimed to represent a consortium of European investors interested in Chicago real estate opportunities. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday evening at what Arthur described as a private club that catered to serious business professionals who needed a discreet environment for sensitive financial discussions. Thomas had been struggling with his career advancement at the law firm, feeling overlooked for promotions despite his competent work and professional dedication. The invitation seemed to represent exactly the kind of networking opportunity that could transform his professional prospects, connecting him with sophisticated investors who might value his financial expertise and analytical skills. The Golden Circle occupied the entire second floor of what appeared to be a legitimate import business, accessible through a private elevator that required a special key. The atmosphere was markedly different from basement speakeasies like the Blue Moon, featuring expensive furnishings, original artwork, and an ambience of serious business rather than rebellious entertainment. Arthur introduced Thomas to a dozen other men who appeared to be successful professionals and businessmen, each carrying themselves with the confidence that came from substantial financial resources and social connections. The conversation focused on legitimate business topics, real estate development opportunities, import regulations, and financial strategies that seemed entirely legal and professionally appropriate. The alcohol served at the Golden Circle was presented as premium imported spirits, served in crystal glasses and accompanied by elaborate explanations of their European origins and exceptional quality. Thomas, who had been a moderate social drinker before Prohibition, found the liquor far stronger than anything he had previously consumed, but the sophisticated presentation made it seem like a mark of professional advancement rather than dangerous indulgence. What Thomas didn't understand was that the Golden Circle represented the evolution of Chicago's criminal speakeasy culture, following the federal crackdowns that had destroyed establishments like the Blue Moon. Criminal organizations had learned to avoid the obvious signs of illegal drinking establishments, instead creating environments that appeared to be legitimate business venues while serving the same functions of customer recruitment and psychological manipulation. The criminal network that operated the Golden Circle had studied the mistakes made by operators like Vincent Torino, learning to avoid the crude exploitation techniques that had attracted federal attention. Instead of relying on obvious addiction and criminal coercion, they developed subtle methods of psychological manipulation that made their targets feel like willing partners in legitimate business activities. Thomas began attending regular meetings at the Golden Circle, believing he was building professional relationships that would advance his career and financial prospects. The other attendees treated him with respect and apparent friendship, discussing business opportunities that seemed to offer substantial financial rewards for someone with his accounting skills and legal connections. The alcohol consumption at these meetings was carefully regulated to avoid the obvious signs of dangerous intoxication that had characterized places like the Blue Moon. Thomas never experienced the violent sickness or complete loss of control that had marked Margaret's speakeasy experiences, but he was consuming bootleg liquor that was systematically altering his judgment and decision-making capabilities. The criminal recruitment process at the Golden Circle was far more sophisticated than anything Vincent Torino had employed. Instead of exploiting obvious addiction, the operators focused on exploiting professional ambitions, financial anxieties, and social insecurities that made middle-class professionals vulnerable to gradual criminal involvement. Arthur Castellano explained to Thomas that the European investors he represented were interested in acquiring detailed information about Chicago's legal and financial institutions, information that would help them identify the best investment opportunities and avoid potential regulatory problems. Thomas's position at a respected law firm made him ideally suited to provide such information, and his compensation would reflect the value of his contributions. The requests began with information that seemed entirely legitimate: details about property transactions, corporate filings, and regulatory changes that were matters of public record. Thomas felt honored to be providing consulting services to sophisticated international investors, and the monthly payments he received substantially improved his financial situation. But the requests gradually evolved to include information that was clearly confidential. Details about specific legal cases, client financial situations, and internal law firm strategies that Thomas knew he was not authorized to share. The progression was so gradual that Thomas never experienced a clear moment when he recognized he was crossing from legitimate consulting into criminal activity. The psychological techniques employed at the Golden Circle were designed to make criminal activity feel like sophisticated business practice. Thomas was told that the information he provided was being used to help legitimate businesses navigate complex regulatory environments, and that his contributions were essential to successful international business operations. The monthly payments Thomas received for his information were substantial enough to significantly improve his lifestyle, but not so large as to attract attention from colleagues or family members. He was able to move to a better apartment, purchase fashionable clothing, and maintain social activities that enhanced his professional image and self-esteem. More importantly, Thomas had become psychologically dependent on the sense of importance and professional advancement that came from his association with the Golden Circle. The other attendees treated him as a valued colleague and trusted advisor, providing the professional recognition and social acceptance that he had been seeking throughout his career. By the fall of 1925, Thomas was providing information that was being used for securities fraud, tax evasion, and corporate extortion schemes that were devastating Chicago's legitimate business community. But the compartmentalized nature of his involvement prevented him from understanding the criminal applications of the information he provided. The criminal network had learned to protect their recruited accomplices from direct knowledge of criminal activities, ensuring that people like Thomas could maintain their self-image as legitimate professionals while participating in comprehensive criminal enterprises. This psychological protection made accomplices more reliable and reduced their likelihood of cooperation with law enforcement authorities. Thomas's criminal involvement escalated when Arthur asked him to provide assistance with what he described as a complex legal matter involving one of their European clients. The client was facing regulatory challenges that required the involvement of someone with Thomas's legal expertise and institutional connections. The assistance Arthur requested involved Thomas using his position at the law firm to access confidential legal documents, modify court filings, and provide inside information about judicial proceedings that could be used to influence the outcomes of specific legal cases. Thomas understood that these activities were clearly illegal, but his financial dependence on the criminal organization and his psychological investment in his professional relationship with Arthur made refusal seem impossible. The toxic alcohol that Thomas consumed during his regular meetings at the Golden Circle was having cumulative effects on his physical and mental health, though the symptoms were subtle enough that he attributed them to work stress and the demands of his increasingly complex professional activities. He was experiencing memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and episodes of anxiety that made normal legal work increasingly challenging. Dr. Harold Winters began treating Thomas in early 1926, when Thomas sought medical attention for what he described as chronic fatigue and digestive problems. Dr. Winters immediately recognized the symptoms of toxic alcohol consumption, but Thomas was so deeply embedded in the criminal network that he was unable to discuss the true source of his health problems. Dr. Winters' medical records from this period document the systematic physical deterioration that affected people who were consuming bootleg alcohol on a regular basis, even when that consumption appeared to be moderate and socially acceptable. The industrial chemicals used to adulterate bootleg liquor were causing cumulative damage that manifested as a wide range of medical conditions that were rarely connected to alcohol consumption. Thomas's involvement with the criminal network reached a critical point in the spring of 1926, when Arthur asked him to participate in what he described as the most important project their organization had ever undertaken. The project involved systematic manipulation of legal proceedings throughout Chicago's court system, using information and influence provided by recruited accomplices to ensure favorable outcomes for criminal defendants and civil litigants connected to their organization. Thomas's role in the project would involve using his law firm's resources and reputation to file fraudulent legal documents, bribe court officials, and intimidate witnesses in cases involving criminal organization interests. The project represented a comprehensive corruption of Chicago's legal system that would affect hundreds of legitimate legal proceedings over a period of several years. The scope and obvious criminality of the project forced Thomas to confront the reality of what he had become involved in, but his financial and psychological dependence on the criminal organization made withdrawal seem impossible. He had been receiving monthly payments that totaled more than his annual salary from the law firm, and he had become emotionally dependent on the professional recognition and social status that came from his association with Arthur and the other members of the Golden Circle. More critically, Thomas had learned that the criminal organization maintained detailed records of all his previous activities, records that could be used to destroy his legal career and result in criminal prosecution if he chose to terminate his involvement. The same compartmentalization that had protected him from understanding the full scope of his criminal involvement had also created comprehensive documentation that could be used to coerce his continued participation. Thomas agreed to participate in the legal corruption project, not because he wanted to engage in such obviously criminal activity, but because his addiction and criminal involvement had eliminated his ability to make independent decisions about his professional and personal life. He had become a slave to the criminal organization, controlled through a combination of financial dependence, psychological manipulation, and explicit threats of exposure and prosecution. The legal corruption project that Thomas participated in had devastating effects on Chicago's judicial system, creating a network of compromised legal proceedings that affected thousands of legitimate cases over a period of several years. Innocent defendants were convicted through fabricated evidence, while guilty parties connected to the criminal organization escaped prosecution through systematic witness intimidation and judicial bribery. The project also created a comprehensive system for identifying and recruiting additional accomplices within Chicago's legal community, using information provided by Thomas and others to target lawyers, judges, and court officials who might be vulnerable to various forms of criminal exploitation. Thomas's health continued deteriorating as his involvement in criminal activities intensified and his consumption of toxic bootleg alcohol increased. He was experiencing severe neurological symptoms that affected his ability to practice law competently, while his psychological condition was marked by episodes of paranoia, depression, and anxiety that made normal social interaction almost impossible. The criminal organization that controlled Thomas had developed sophisticated methods for managing accomplices whose health and psychological condition were deteriorating due to their criminal involvement and toxic alcohol consumption. Rather than providing medical treatment or reducing criminal demands, they increased their control over such accomplices, using their vulnerability to extract maximum value before discarding them entirely. By 1927, Thomas was participating in criminal activities that included murder, systematic judicial corruption, and comprehensive fraud schemes that were affecting every aspect of Chicago's legal and business community. But his deteriorating mental condition and physical health made him increasingly unreliable as a criminal accomplice, while his obvious involvement in illegal activities was attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement authorities. The federal investigation that had begun with the Blue Moon raid had evolved into a comprehensive examination of organized crime throughout Chicago, with particular focus on the recruitment and exploitation of legitimate professionals for criminal purposes. Thomas's name had appeared in federal surveillance reports as early as 1926, when agents began documenting the systematic corruption of legal proceedings throughout the city's court system. Federal investigators had identified the pattern of recruitment and exploitation that connected cases like Margaret's and Thomas's, recognizing that criminal organizations were systematically targeting middle-class professionals whose legitimate employment provided access to information and services that could be used for criminal purposes. The investigation revealed that the criminal networks operating throughout Chicago had developed recruitment and control methods that were far more sophisticated than traditional organized crime techniques, creating systems of psychological manipulation and financial dependence that made their accomplices more reliable and more difficult for law enforcement to identify and prosecute. Thomas's involvement with the criminal organization ended abruptly in the fall of 1927, when federal agents raided the Golden Circle and arrested Arthur Castellano, along with most of the other regular attendees. Thomas was found unconscious in a back room, suffering from acute alcohol poisoning caused by consuming bootleg liquor that had been deliberately adulterated with lethal concentrations of industrial chemicals. The circumstances of Thomas's poisoning suggested that the criminal organization had decided to eliminate him as a potential witness rather than risk his cooperation with federal investigators. The same toxic alcohol that had been used to control and exploit him had been weaponized to ensure his silence about the criminal activities he had participated in. Thomas survived the immediate effects of the poisoning, but his physical and mental condition had been so severely damaged by years of toxic alcohol consumption and psychological manipulation that he was unable to provide coherent testimony about his criminal involvement. Federal prosecutors recognized that he was a victim of criminal exploitation rather than a willing criminal conspirator, but his inability to communicate effectively made him useless as a witness against the organization that had destroyed his life. Dr. Harold Winters treated Thomas during his recovery from the acute poisoning, documenting the comprehensive physical and psychological damage that had resulted from his involvement with Chicago's evolved speakeasy culture. Thomas's liver function was severely compromised. His nervous system showed evidence of permanent damage from industrial chemical exposure, and his mental condition was characterized by episodes of confusion, memory loss, and emotional instability that made normal social functioning impossible. The medical treatment available to Thomas was limited by the primitive understanding of toxic alcohol effects and psychological trauma that characterized medical practice in the 1920s. Dr. Winters could address some of the immediate physical symptoms, but there were no effective treatments for the neurological damage or psychological conditioning that had resulted from years of systematic criminal exploitation. Thomas spent the remainder of his life in various medical and charitable institutions, never recovering sufficiently to resume independent living or meaningful employment. His legal career was destroyed not just by his criminal involvement, but by the physical and mental incapacity that resulted from his exploitation by the criminal organization. The law firm that had employed Thomas suffered significant reputational damage when his criminal involvement became known, losing several major clients and facing regulatory scrutiny that affected its operations for years. The partners at the firm had no understanding of how their trusted employee had been recruited and controlled by sophisticated criminal operators, and they were unable to implement effective safeguards against similar infiltration in the future. Thomas's family was devastated both financially and emotionally by his involvement with the criminal organization. His parents mortgaged their home to pay for his medical treatment, while his siblings faced social stigma that affected their employment and marriage prospects. The comprehensive nature of the damage caused by Thomas's criminal involvement extended far beyond his individual case, affecting entire networks of family and professional relationships. The criminal organization that had recruited and exploited Thomas adapted quickly to the federal raids and arrests, relocating their operations and developing new methods for avoiding law enforcement scrutiny. The systematic recruitment of legitimate professionals continued under different organizational structures, with criminal operators learning from the mistakes that had led to the exposure of operations like the Golden Circle. Federal investigators who studied Thomas's case recognized that his experience represented a new category of criminal victimization that existing legal frameworks were inadequate to address. Traditional concepts of criminal responsibility assume that defendants had made conscious decisions to participate in illegal activities. But cases like Thomas's involved systematic psychological manipulation and chemical dependency that compromised their ability to make independent decisions. The toxic alcohol that had damaged Thomas's brain and body was part of a broader public health crisis that was affecting thousands of people throughout Chicago's drinking population. Criminal organizations had discovered that deliberately adulterating bootleg liquor with industrial chemicals created more dependent customers while reducing production costs, making toxic alcohol a profitable component of their business model. The industrial chemicals commonly used in bootleg alcohol production included methanol, which caused blindness and neurological damage, lead compounds that affected cognitive function and emotional stability, and various industrial solvents that caused liver and kidney damage. The cumulative effects of consuming such substances created medical conditions that were often misdiagnosed as other diseases, preventing effective treatment and allowing the damage to progress unchecked. Dr. Winters began documenting the medical effects of toxic alcohol consumption in a systematic way, creating detailed case studies that revealed the scope and severity of the public health crisis that was developing within Chicago's drinking population. His research provided some of the first scientific evidence of how criminal organizations were systematically poisoning their customers while extracting maximum profit from their addiction. The research also revealed that the psychological effects of toxic alcohol consumption made victims more susceptible to criminal recruitment and control, creating a vicious cycle where chemical dependency increased vulnerability to exploitation, while criminal involvement increased exposure to toxic substances. Thomas's case became part of Dr. Winters' comprehensive study of criminal exploitation within Chicago's speakeasy culture, though Thomas's identity was protected through the use of pseudonyms and altered personal details. The case study documented the systematic process by which legitimate professionals were recruited, controlled, and ultimately destroyed by criminal organizations that had evolved far beyond simple bootlegging operations. The study revealed that criminal organizations had developed sophisticated understanding of human psychology, using scientific principles of behavioral modification to create dependencies and control mechanisms that were far more effective than traditional criminal coercion methods. The recruitment techniques employed by organizations like the Golden Circle were based on careful study of their targets' psychological vulnerabilities, financial pressures, and social insecurities. Criminal operators learned to identify professionals who were dissatisfied with their career advancement, struggling with financial pressures, or seeking enhanced social status that could be exploited through carefully structured criminal involvement. The control mechanisms used to maintain accomplice loyalty and prevent defection were based on creating multiple forms of dependency that made withdrawal from criminal involvement seem impossible. Financial dependency was created through payments that became essential to maintaining desired lifestyle improvements, while psychological dependency was created through social environments that provided recognition and status unavailable in legitimate professional contexts. Thomas died in 1932 at the age of 37. His death certificate listing complications from liver failure as the immediate cause. Like Margaret's death, there was no official recognition that Thomas had been a victim of systematic criminal exploitation, or that his medical condition was the direct result of consuming toxic bootleg alcohol over a period of several years. Dr. Winters conducted an unofficial examination of Thomas's body that revealed the extent of the physical damage caused by years of toxic alcohol consumption and psychological stress. Thomas's brain showed evidence of severe neurological damage consistent with chronic methanol exposure, while his liver and kidneys had been destroyed by industrial chemicals commonly used in bootleg alcohol production. The examination also revealed evidence of malnutrition and physical neglect that suggested Thomas had been unable to care for himself adequately during the final years of his life. The criminal organization that had exploited him had provided no support or assistance after he became unable to perform useful services, abandoning him to whatever medical and charitable resources were available to indigent former criminals. Thomas's funeral was attended by fewer than half a dozen people, primarily medical and charitable workers who had cared for him during his final years of incapacity. None of his former colleagues from the law firm attended, and there was no recognition that his death represented the conclusion of a systematic criminal exploitation that had affected hundreds of similar cases throughout Chicago. The criminal methods that had been used to recruit and control Thomas continued evolving and spreading throughout organized crime operations across the United States. The systematic recruitment of legitimate professionals became a standard technique for criminal organizations seeking to expand their operations and protect themselves from law enforcement scrutiny. The psychological manipulation techniques that had been developed within Chicago's speakeasy culture became permanent features of organized crime methodology, influencing everything from labor racketeering to political corruption to narcotics distribution. Criminal operators had learned that systematic exploitation of human psychological vulnerabilities was far more profitable and sustainable than traditional methods based on violence and intimidation. The toxic alcohol that had destroyed Thomas's health represented just one component of a broader pattern of criminal exploitation that prioritized short-term profit extraction over any consideration of long-term consequences for victims or society. Criminal organizations had discovered that they could maximize profits by systematically destroying their customers' health while creating dependencies that made those customers unable to seek help or escape their exploitation. The public health crisis created by toxic alcohol consumption extended far beyond individual cases like Thomas's, affecting entire communities throughout Chicago and other major American cities. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering from mysterious neurological conditions, liver diseases, and psychological disorders that were actually caused by consuming chemically adulterated bootleg liquor. The social stigma associated with drinking problems prevented many victims from seeking appropriate medical treatment, while the primitive state of medical understanding about toxic alcohol effects meant that even patients who did seek treatment rarely received effective care. Most victims of toxic alcohol poisoning were misdiagnosed with other conditions, preventing proper treatment and allowing the underlying damage to progress unchecked. Dr. Winter's research on toxic alcohol effects was largely ignored by the broader medical community, which was reluctant to acknowledge that illegal drinking could be causing such widespread medical problems. The social and political pressures surrounding prohibition made it difficult for medical professionals to conduct honest research about the health consequences of bootleg alcohol consumption. The economic impact of cases like Thomas's extended far beyond the immediate costs of medical treatment and lost productivity. The systematic corruption of legal proceedings affected thousands of legitimate legal cases, creating economic losses that totaled millions of dollars throughout Chicago's business community. The corruption also undermined public confidence in legal institutions, creating social costs that were difficult to quantify, but that affected the entire fabric of civic life in Chicago. Citizens lost faith in the fairness and integrity of legal proceedings, while businesses were forced to factor the possibility of systematic corruption into their planning and decision-making processes. Thomas's story, like Margaret's, remained largely invisible to the public and to historical accounts of Chicago's Prohibition era. The sophisticated nature of his criminal exploitation made it difficult for observers to understand what had happened to him, while the social stigma associated with his involvement made family and colleagues reluctant to discuss his case openly. The criminal organization that had recruited and destroyed Thomas continued operating under different names and leadership structures, adapting their methods to changing enforcement patterns while maintaining their focus on systematic recruitment and exploitation of legitimate professionals. The federal investigation that had exposed Thomas's involvement eventually resulted in the prosecution of dozens of criminal operators throughout Chicago, but the sentences were relatively light, and most defendants were released within a few years. The criminal methods and organizational structures they had developed continued operating under new leadership, making the prosecutions largely ineffective at preventing continued criminal exploitation. The legal framework that existed in the 1920s was inadequate to address the systematic nature of criminal organizations, like the one that had recruited Thomas. Traditional criminal law focused on individual crimes and specific criminal acts, but cases like Thomas's involved comprehensive criminal enterprises that operated through complex webs of legitimate and illegitimate activities. Federal prosecutors struggled to develop legal theories that could address the systematic recruitment and exploitation of victims like Thomas, while defense attorneys argued successfully that their clients had been coerced into criminal involvement through addiction and psychological manipulation that compromised their legal responsibility. The ambiguous legal status of victims like Thomas created practical problems for law enforcement agencies, which were unsure whether to treat such individuals as criminals who should be prosecuted or as victims who deserved protection and assistance. The lack of clear legal precedents made it difficult to develop consistent enforcement policies or effective prevention strategies. Thomas's case contributed to the gradual development of legal concepts that recognized coercion and diminished capacity as factors that could reduce criminal responsibility, though such concepts wouldn't be fully developed or widely accepted for several decades after his death. The medical understanding of addiction and psychological manipulation that was needed to properly address cases like Thomas's was also decades away from development. The primitive state of psychological and neurological medicine in the 1920s meant that the mechanisms by which criminal organizations controlled their victims were poorly understood and ineffectively treated. Dr. Winter's research on cases like Thomas's provided some of the earliest scientific documentation of how systematic criminal exploitation could compromise individual decision-making capacity and create dependencies that were resistant to conventional treatment approaches. The research also revealed the inadequacy of existing medical and social service systems to address the complex needs of victims who had been systematically exploited by sophisticated criminal organizations. Traditional approaches to treating addiction and criminal involvement were based on assumptions about individual moral responsibility that didn't account for the systematic psychological manipulation that characterized cases like Thomas's. The social services that were available to help people like Thomas were primarily charitable organizations that focused on providing basic necessities rather than addressing the complex psychological and medical problems created by systematic criminal exploitation. Most charitable workers had no understanding of the sophisticated criminal methods that had been used to recruit and control their clients, making their assistance largely ineffective. The long-term social costs of cases like Thomas's included not just the direct costs of medical treatment and lost productivity, but also the broader impact on social trust and institutional effectiveness that resulted from systematic corruption of legal and business systems. Communities throughout Chicago were affected by the realization that respected professionals like Thomas could be recruited and controlled by criminal organizations, creating suspicion and uncertainty that affected normal business and social relationships. The knowledge that criminal organizations had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities created a climate of social anxiety that extended far beyond the immediate victims of such exploitation. Thomas's story represents one of thousands of similar cases that occurred throughout Chicago during the Prohibition era, each following the same pattern of recruitment, exploitation, and ultimate destruction that characterized the evolved speakeasy culture that emerged after the crude establishments like the Blue Moon were shut down by federal authorities. The criminal innovation that occurred during this period created methods of exploitation that continued affecting American organized crime for decades, influencing everything from political corruption to labor racketeering to narcotics distribution. The systematic recruitment of legitimate professionals became a permanent feature of organized crime operations, while the psychological manipulation techniques that were developed within speakeasy culture became standard tools for criminal organizations seeking to expand their operations and protect themselves from law enforcement scrutiny. The toxic alcohol that destroyed Thomas's health represented just one component of a broader pattern of criminal exploitation that prioritized profit extraction over any consideration of victim welfare or social consequences. Criminal organizations learned that they could maximize profits by systematically destroying their victims while creating dependencies that made those victims unable to seek help or escape their exploitation. The public health consequences of this approach extended far beyond individual cases, creating medical and social problems that affected entire communities and overwhelmed existing healthcare and social service systems. The economic consequences included not just the direct costs of treating victims like Thomas, but also the broader economic damage caused by systematic corruption of business and legal institutions that undermined normal commercial relationships and civic functions. Thomas Brady's death in 1932 marked the end of another individual story of systematic criminal exploitation. But the methods that had been used to recruit and destroy him continued evolving and spreading throughout American organized crime. The sophisticated understanding of human psychology that criminal organizations developed during the Prohibition era created capabilities for exploitation that extended far beyond illegal alcohol distribution, influencing criminal activities that continued affecting American society for generations. The speakeasy culture that had promised sophisticated social experiences and professional advancement had actually created systems of exploitation that were more comprehensive and destructive than anything that had existed in American criminal history. The romantic image of Prohibition-era drinking establishments that persists in popular culture bears no resemblance to the reality experienced by victims like Thomas, whose professional success and personal integrity were systematically destroyed by criminal organizations that understood exactly how to monetize human ambition and vulnerability. The pattern that destroyed Thomas Brady was simultaneously playing out in countless other lives across Chicago. But perhaps nowhere was the systematic nature of this exploitation more evident than in the story of Elena Rossetti, a 26-year-old seamstress who worked in one of the city's most prestigious dress shops on Michigan Avenue. Elena's introduction to Chicago's evolved speakeasy culture came through what appeared to be a stroke of extraordinary good fortune. In the summer of 1926, she was approached by a well-dressed woman named Catherine Morrison, who claimed to represent a group of wealthy socialites interested in commissioning custom evening gowns for exclusive private parties. Catherine explained that these parties required absolute discretion, as they were attended by prominent business leaders and political figures who needed to maintain their public reputations while enjoying sophisticated social entertainment. The clothing requirements were specific and elaborate, calling for designs that would reflect the refined tastes of Chicago's most successful citizens. The financial opportunity was substantial. Catherine offered to pay Elena 3 times her normal rates for designs that would be worn at these exclusive gatherings, with the possibility of ongoing work if her initial efforts proved satisfactory. For Elena, who had been struggling to save money for her own dress shop, the opportunity seemed like the answer to years of financial limitations. What Elena didn't understand was that Catherine Morrison represented the same criminal network that had recruited and destroyed people like Margaret Sullivan and Thomas Brady. The organization had learned that controlling the fashion and social presentation aspects of their operations provided another avenue for recruiting and exploiting talented individuals whose work was essential to maintaining the sophisticated atmospheres that made their criminal activities possible. The private parties that Elena was designing for were elaborate criminal gatherings where business leaders, political figures, and criminal operators met to coordinate activities that included systematic corruption of municipal government, large-scale fraud operations, and the distribution of narcotics throughout Chicago's business district. Elena's role in these operations began innocently enough, creating elegant evening wear that helped maintain the sophisticated social atmosphere that was essential to the organization's recruitment and control methods. But the criminal network had learned that talented individuals like Elena could be gradually drawn into more comprehensive involvement through careful manipulation of their professional ambitions and financial needs. The first party Eleanor attended as a designer consultant was held in a private mansion on the Gold Coast, featuring an atmosphere of refined elegance that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. The guests were impeccably dressed and obviously wealthy, discussing business opportunities and social activities with the kind of sophisticated conversation that Elena had always associated with high society. The alcohol served at these gatherings was presented as the finest imported spirits, though it was actually bootleg liquor that had been carefully filtered and flavored to disguise its toxic origins. Elena, who rarely drank alcohol, found herself consuming cocktails that were far stronger than anything she had previously experienced, but the elegant presentation and social pressure made refusal seem inappropriate. Catherine introduced Eleanor to several guests, who expressed admiration for her design work and suggested additional opportunities for collaboration. These individuals presented themselves as successful business people and socialites who appreciated quality craftsmanship and were willing to pay premium prices for exceptional work. What Elena couldn't see was that these supposedly legitimate business people were actually criminal operators who used their wealth and social connections to facilitate illegal activities throughout Chicago's business community. The sophisticated social atmosphere was carefully constructed theater designed to make criminal activities appear to be normal business operations. Over the following months, Elena began attending these private gatherings regularly, both as a designer providing services and as a social participant who was gradually being integrated into the organization's criminal operations. The alcohol consumption that accompanied these events was systematically affecting her judgment and decision-making capabilities, though the effects were subtle enough that she attributed them to the excitement and sophistication of her new social environment. The criminal organization began requesting services from Eleanor that went beyond simple dress design. They needed someone who could create disguises and false identities for criminal operators who needed to appear respectable during business transactions. They needed someone who could modify clothing to conceal weapons or stolen goods during criminal activities. They needed someone who could use her legitimate business connections to gather information about potential targets for criminal exploitation. Elena's gradual transition from legitimate designer to criminal accomplice followed the same pattern that had characterized the recruitment of Margaret and Thomas. Each request seemed like a reasonable extension of her existing work, and the financial compensation was substantial enough to significantly improve her living situation and professional prospects. The toxic alcohol that Elena consumed at these criminal gatherings was having cumulative effects on her physical and mental health, though the symptoms developed slowly enough that she attributed them to the stress and excitement of her expanding professional opportunities. She was experiencing memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and episodes of anxiety that made her regular work at the dress shop increasingly challenging. By early 1927, Eleanor was participating in criminal activities that included creating false identification documents, modifying stolen goods to disguise their origins, and using her position at the dress shop to gather information about wealthy customers who might be targeted for various criminal schemes. The dress shop where Elena worked catered to Chicago's wealthiest women, providing her with access to information about their personal lives, financial situations, and social activities that was extremely valuable to criminal operators, planning burglaries, kidnapping schemes, and extortion operations. Elena's employers at the dress shop had no awareness that their trusted employee was systematically gathering intelligence that was being used to target their customers for criminal exploitation. The sophisticated nature of Elena's recruitment and the gradual progression of her criminal involvement made her activities virtually invisible to normal business oversight. Dr. Harold Winters began treating Elena in the spring of 1927 when she sought medical attention for what she described as chronic headaches and digestive problems that were interfering with her work performance. Dr. Winters immediately recognized the symptoms of toxic alcohol consumption. Though Elena was unable to discuss the true source of her health problems due to her involvement with the criminal organization, Elena's medical condition revealed the same pattern of systematic poisoning that Dr. Winters had observed in other victims of Chicago's evolved speakeasy culture. Her liver function was declining, her nervous system showed evidence of chemical damage, and her psychological condition was characterized by increasing dependence on alcohol to manage anxiety and depression. The criminal organization that controlled Elena had developed sophisticated methods for managing accomplices whose health was deteriorating due to toxic alcohol consumption and psychological stress. Rather than providing medical assistance or reducing criminal demands, they increased their control over such individuals, using their vulnerability to extract maximum value before discarding them entirely. Elena's criminal activities reached a crisis point in the summer of 1927 when the organization asked her to participate in a kidnapping scheme targeting the daughter of one of her dress shop customers. The plan involved using Elena's knowledge of the family's routines and social activities to facilitate the abduction, while her legitimate employment would provide perfect cover for the intelligence gathering that was necessary for the operation's success. The kidnapping scheme represented a level of criminal activity that Elena couldn't rationalize as sophisticated business practice, forcing her to confront the reality of what she had become involved in. But her addiction to alcohol and her financial dependence on the criminal organization made refusal seem impossible, while her knowledge of the organization's activities made her a liability that they couldn't afford to release. Elena's attempt to withdraw from criminal involvement resulted in systematic intimidation that included threats against her family, destruction of her personal property, and economic pressure that threatened her legitimate employment. The criminal organization had developed comprehensive methods for preventing accomplice defection that made escape virtually impossible once individuals had been fully recruited. The psychological techniques used to control Elena were based on creating multiple forms of dependency that made withdrawal from criminal involvement seem more dangerous than continued participation. She was told that law enforcement authorities were aware of her criminal activities and would prosecute her if she attempted to seek help, while the organization claimed they could provide protection from prosecution as long as she remained loyal. Elena's participation in the kidnapping scheme was prevented only by the intervention of federal agents who had been conducting surveillance of the criminal organization's activities. The federal investigation had identified Elena as a recruited accomplice rather than a willing criminal, though her extensive involvement in illegal activities made her prosecution a possibility if she refused to cooperate with authorities. The federal agents who interviewed Elena discovered that she had been systematically poisoned with toxic alcohol over a period of more than a year, creating physical and psychological dependencies that had compromised her ability to make independent decisions about her involvement in criminal activities. Elena's cooperation with federal authorities provided crucial evidence about the systematic recruitment and control methods used by Chicago's criminal organizations, though her testimony was limited by the memory problems and cognitive impairment caused by toxic alcohol consumption. The criminal organization that had recruited Elena was dismantled through federal prosecutions that resulted in the conviction of more than 40 criminal operators, though the sentences were relatively light, and most defendants were released within a few years of their conviction. Elena survived her involvement with the criminal organization, but her physical and mental health had been permanently damaged by toxic alcohol consumption and psychological manipulation. She was unable to return to her work as a seamstress due to the hand tremors and visual problems caused by methanol poisoning, while her psychological condition was characterized by chronic anxiety and depression that made normal social interaction extremely difficult. The dress shop where Elena had worked was forced to close after customers learned about her criminal involvement, destroying the livelihoods of several other employees who had no knowledge of or involvement in Elena's criminal activities. So there you have it. The real story behind Chicago's speakeasies wasn't the glamorous rebellion we've been sold. It was systematic exploitation disguised as sophistication, turning ordinary people into casualties of criminal enterprise. Margaret, Thomas, Elena, and thousands like them weren't just drinking in hidden basements. They were being methodically destroyed by organizations that understood exactly how to weaponize human vulnerability for profit. The next time you see a romantic portrayal of Prohibition-era nightlife, remember these names, remember their stories, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones that promise you freedom.